Welcome, everyone. My name is Mariah. Most of you probably know that because otherwise, why would you be listening to this? But if you don't, this is sort of my test book, I guess. I'm going to be attempting to improve my skills as a narrator and as a reader out louder. It sounded better in my head. But with this test, because it's going just to kind of be to see where I'm at, I'm not going to redo it if I make mistakes. I will not be editing out my mistakes because I know if I try and do that, I'll be less likely to get this done. So I'm just going to read as though we were all sitting in a living room. You know, if we were sitting in a living room and I was reading to you and I made a mistake, I wouldn't have the ability to go back and change it. So just pretend that we're sitting in the living room and I'm reading you this book. Happens to be one of my favorites. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Chapter 1. The Riverbank. The mole had been working very hard all morning, spring cleaning his little home, first with brooms and then with dusters, then on ladders and steps and chairs, with a brush and a pail of whitewash, till he had dust in his throat and eyes and splashes of whitewash all over his little black fur, and an aching back and weary arms. Spring was moving in the earth above, and in the earth below and around him, penetrating even his dark and lowly little house, with its spirit of divine discontent and longing. It was small wonder, then, that suddenly he flung down his brush on the floor and said, "Bother," and "Oh, blow," and also "Hang spring cleaning," and bolted out of the house without even waiting to put on his coat. Something up above was calling him imperiously, and he made for the steep little tunnel, which answered, in his case, to a gravelled carriage drive, owned by animals whose residents are nearer to the sun and air. So he scraped and scratched, and scrabbled and scrooged, and then he scrooged again, and scrabbled and scratched and scraped, working busily with his little paws, and muttering to himself, "Up we go, up we go," till at last, pop! His head came out into the sunlight, and he found himself rolling in the warm grass of a great meadow. "This is fine," he said to himself. "Well, this is better than whitewash." The sunshine struck hot on his fur. The soft breeze caressed his heated brow, and after the seclusion of the cellarage he had lived in so long, the carol of happy birds fell on his dulled hearing almost like a shout. Jumping on all four legs at once, in the joy of living and the delight of spring without its cleaning, he pushed his way across the meadow till he reached a hedge on the further side. "Hold up," said an elderly rabbit at the gap. "Sixpence for privilege of passing by the private road." He was bowed over in an instant by the mole, impatient and contemptuous. Mole, who trotted along the side of the hedge, chaffing the other rabbits as they peeped hurriedly from their holes to see what the row was about. "Onion sauce," he remarked jeeringly, and was gone before they had thought of a thoroughly satisfactory reply. Then they all started grumbling to each other at once. "How stupid you are! Well, why didn't you tell him? Well, why didn't you say? Well, you might have reminded him." And so on in the usual way, but of course it was much too late, as is the case. It seemed too good to be true. Hither and thither through the meadows he rambled busily, along the hedgerows, across the copses, finding everywhere birds building, flowers budding, leaves thrusting, and everything happy, in the progressive and occupied. And instead of having an uneasy conscience prickling him and whispering, "Whitewash," he somehow could only feel how jolly it was to be the only idle dog among all these busy citizens. After all, the best part of a holiday is perhaps not so much resting yourself as seeing all the other fellows busy working. He thought his happiness was complete when he meandered aimlessly along and suddenly stood by the edge of a full-fed river. Never in his life had he seen a river before. This sleek, sinuous, full-bodied animal, chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle and leaving them with a laugh, to fling itself on fresh playmates that shook themselves free and were caught and held again. All was a snake, a shiver, a glint and gleams and sparkle, a rustle and swirl, chatter and bubble. The mole was bewitched. entranced, fascinated. By the side of the river he trotted, as one trots when very small, by the side of a man who holds one spellbound with exciting stories. And when tired at last, he sat on the bank while the river still chattered on to him, a babbling procession of best stories in the world, sent from the heart of the earth to be told at last to the insatiable sea. As he sat on the grass and looked across the river, a dark hole on the opposite bank just above the water's edge caught his eye. Dreamily he fell to considering what a nice snug dwelling place it would make for an animal with few wants and fond of riverside residence, above flood level and remote from noise and dust. As he gazed, something bright seemed to twinkle down in the heart of it, vanished, and then twinkled once more like a teeny star. But it could hardly be a star in such an unlikely situation, and it was too glittering and small for a glowworm. As he looked, it winked at him, and so declared itself to be an eye, and a small face began gradually to grow up around it, like a frame around a picture. A brown little face with whiskers, a grave round little face with the same twinkle in the eye that had first attracted his notice, small neat ears and thick silky hair. It was the water rat. The two animals stood and regarded each other cautiously. "Hello, Mole," said the water rat. "Hello, Rat," said the Mole. "Would you like to come over?" inquired the rat presently. "Oh, it's all very well to talk," said the Mole, rather pettishly, being new to a river and riverside life in its ways. The rat said nothing, but stooped and unfastened a rope and hauled on it, then lightly stepped into a little boat, which the Mole had not observed. It was painted blue outside and white within, and was just the size for two animals, and Mole's whole heart went out to it at once, even though he did not fully understand its uses. The rat sculled smartly across and made fast. Then he held up his forepaw as the Mole stepped down. "Lean on that," he said. "Now then, step lively." The Mole, to his surprise and rapture, found himself actually seated in the stern of a real boat. "Oh, this has been a wonderful day," he said as the rat shoved off and took the sculls again. "Do you know, I've never been a boat before at all. I've never been in a boat before at all in my life." "What?" cried the rat, open-mouthed. "Never been in a... Why, you never... Well, what have you been doing then?" "Is it so nice as all that?" asked the Mole shyly, though he was quite prepared to believe it, as he leant back in his seat and surveyed the cushions, the oars, the row-blocks, and all the fascinating fittings, and felt the boat sway lightly under him. "Nice? It's the only thing," said the water rat, solemnly, as he leant forward for his stroke. "Believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing around in boats. Simply messing," he went on dreamily, "messing about in boats, messing—" "Oh, look ahead, Rat!" cried the Mole suddenly. It was too late. The boat struck the bank full tilt. The dreamer, the joyous oarsman, lay on his back at the bottom of the boat with his heels in the air. "About in boats, or with boats?" the rat went on composedly, picking himself up with a pleasant laugh. "In or out of them, it doesn't matter. Nothing really seems to matter. That's the charm of it. Whether you get away, or whether you don't, or whether you arrive at your destination, or whether you reach somewhere else, or whether you never get anywhere at all, or you're always busy and you never do anything in particular. And when you've done, there's always something else to do, and you can do it if you like, but you'd much better not. Look here, if you've really got nothing else on hand this morning, supposing we drop down the river together and have a long day of it." The Mole wagged his toes from sheer happiness, spread his chest with a sigh of full contentment, and leaned back blissfully on the soft cushions. "What a day I'm having," he said. "Let us start at once." "Hold on a minute, then," said the rat, and he looped the painter through the He looped the rope through the ring on its landing stage and climbed into the hole above. After a short interval, he reappeared, staggering under a fat whisker luncheon basket. "Shove that under your feet," he observed to the Mole, as he passed it down into the boat. And then he untied the rope and took the skulls again. "What's inside?" asked the moat, wriggling with curiosity. "There's cold chicken inside it," replied the rat briefly. "Cold chicken, cold tongue, cold ham, cold beef, cold pickles, cold pickles." Pardon me, the author who wrote this at this point put absolutely no periods in, so hang on again. "There's cold chicken inside of it," replied the rat briefly. "Cold tongue, cold ham, cold beef, pickled ginger salsa, dinner rolls, and something else. Ginger beer, lemonade, salt, what? Okay. "Oh, stop, cried the mole in ecstasy. "This is too much." "Do you really think so?" inquired the rat seriously. "It's only what I always take on these little excursions. The other animals are always telling me I'm a mean beast and cut it very fine." The mole never heard a word he was saying. Absorbed in the new life he was entering upon, intoxicated with the sparkle, the ripple, the scents, the sounds, and the sunlight, he trailed a paw in the water and dreamed long waking dreams. The water rat, like a good fellow he was, sculled steadily on, forebode to disturb him. "I like your clothes awfully, old chap," he remarked after some half hour or so had passed. "I'm going to get myself a black smoking jacket suit myself one day, as soon as I can afford it." "I beg your pardon," said the mole, pulling himself together. "You must think me very rude, but this is all so new to me. So this is a river." "The river," corrected the rat. "And you really live by the river? What a jolly life!" "By it, and with it, and on it, and in it," said the rat. "It's brother and sister to me, and aunts, and company, and food and drink, and naturally washing. It's my world, and I don't want any other. What it hasn't got is not worth having, and what it doesn't know is not worth knowing. Oh, the times we've had together, whether in winter or summer or spring or autumn. It's always got its fun and excitement. When the floods are on in February, and my cellars and basement are brimming with drink that's no good to me, and the brown water runs by my best bedroom window. Or again, when it all drops away and slows in patches of mud that smells like plum cake, and the rushes and weed clog the channels, and I can potter about on dry shod over most of the bed of it and find fresh food to eat, and things that careless people have dropped out of boats." "But isn't it a bit dull at times?" the mole ventured to ask. "Just you and the river, and no one else to pass a word with?" "No one else to... well, I mustn't be hard on you," said the rat with forbearance. "You're new to it, and of course you don't know. The bank is so crowded nowadays that many people are moving away altogether. Oh no, it isn't what it used to be at all. Otters, kingfishers, dabchicks, moorhens, all of them about all day and always wanting you to do something, as if a fellow had no business of his own to attend to." "What lies over there?" asked the mole, waving a paw toward a background of woodland that darkly framed the water meadows on one side of the river. "That? Oh, that's just the wild wood," said the rat shortly. "We don't go there very much, we riverbankers." Aren't there very nice people in there?" said the mole, a trifle nervously. "Well," replied the water rat, "let me see, the squirrels are all right, and the rabbits, some of them, but rabbits are a mixed lot. And then, of course, there's Badger. He lives right in the heart of it. Wouldn't have it any other way if you asked him, or if you paid him to do it. Dear old Badger, nobody interferes with him. They'd better not," he added significantly. "Why? Who should interfere with him?" asked the mole. "Well, of course, there are others," explained the rat in a hesitant sort of way. "Weasels and stoats and foxes and so on. They're all right in a way, and I'm very good friends with them. Past the time of day when we meet and all that, but they do break out sometimes. There's no denying it. And then, well, you can't really trust them, and that's the fact." The mole knew that it was quite against animal etiquette to dwell on the possibility of trouble ahead, or even allude to it, so he dropped the subject. "And beyond the wildwood again?" he asked, "where it's all blue and dim, and one sees what may be hills, or perhaps it mayn't, and there's something like the smoke of towns, or is it only cloud drift? Beyond the wild wood comes the wide world, said the rat, and that's something that doesn't matter to either you or me. I've never been there, and I'm never going, nor you either if you've got any sense at all. Don't ever refer to it again, please. And now then, here's our backwater at last, where we're going to lunch. Leaving the main stream, they now passed into what seemed to be at first like a little landlocked lake. Green turf sloped down on either edge. Brown, snaky tree roots gleamed below the surface of the quiet water, while ahead of them the silvery shoulder of the foamy tumble of a weir, arm in arm with the restless dripping of a mill wheel that held its turn. Pardon me for that interruption. Had to go check a warning we had in the area, but it's just flash flood, so we're good. Okay, let's see. With a restless, dripping meal wheel that held up in its turn a gray, gabbled meal house, filled the air with a soothing murmur of sound, dull and smoothery, yet with clear voices speaking up cheerfully out of it at intervals. It was so very beautiful that the mole could only hold up both forepaws and gasp, "Oh my, oh my, oh my." The rat brought the boat alongside the bank and made her fast, helped the still awkward mole safely ashore, and swung out the luncheon basket. The mole begged as a favor to be allowed to unpack it all by himself, and the rat was very pleased to indulge him, and to sprawl full length on the grass and rest, while his excited friend took out the tablecloth and spread it out and took out all the mysterious packets one by one and arranged their contents in due order, still gasping, "Oh my," with each fresh revelation. When it was all ready, the rat said, "Now pitch in, old fellow." The mole was indeed very glad to obey, for he had started spring cleaning at a very early hour that morning, as people will do, and had not paused for a bite or sup, and he had been through a very great deal since that distant time which now seemed so many days ago. "What are you looking at?" said the rat presently. That seems so many days ago. "What are you looking at?" said the rat presently, when the edge of their hunger was somewhat dulled, and the mole's eyes were able to wander off the tablecloth a little. "I am looking," said the mole, "at a streak of bubbles that I see travelling along the surface of the water. It is a thing that strikes me as funny." "Bubbles? Oh!" said the rat, and chirped cheerfully in an inviting sort of way. A broad, glistening muzzle showed itself above the edge of the bank, and the otter hauled himself out of the water. Sorry, I'm getting text messages. A broad, glistening muzzle showed itself above the edge of the bank, and the otter hauled himself out and shook the water from his coat. "Greet you, beggars," he observed, making for the... See, this is why we just do test. "Greet you, beggars," he observed, making for the provender. "Why didn't you invite me, Ratty?" "It was an impromptu affair," explained the rat. "By the way, my friend Mr. Mole." "Proud, I'm sure," said the otter, and the two animals were friends forthwith. "Such a rumpus everywhere," continued the otter. "All the world seems to be out on the river today. I came up this backwater to try to get a moment's peace and stumble on to you two fellows at last. I beg your pardon, I didn't exactly mean that, you know." There was a rustle behind them, proceeding from a hedgerow wherein last year's leaves still clung thick. A stripy head, with high shoulders behind it, peered forth on them. "Come on, Badger," shouted the rat. Badger trotted forward a pace or two and then grunted, "Company," as he turned his back and disappeared from view. "That's just the sort of fellow he is," observed the disappointed rat. "Simply hates society. We shan't see any more of him today. Well, tell us, who's about on the river?" "Toad's out for one," replied the otter. "Toad's out for one," replied the otter. "In his brand new larger boat. New togs, new everything." The two animals looked at each other and laughed. "Once it was nothing but sailing," said the rat, "and he tried that and "Once it was nothing but sailing," said the rat. "Then he tired of that and took to punting, and nothing would please him more than to punt about all day, every day, and a nice mess he made of it. Last year it was houseboating, and we all had to go and stay with him in his houseboat and pretend that we liked it. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a houseboat. It's all the same. Whatever he takes up, he gets tired of it and starts on something fresh. Oh, such a good fellow, too, remarked the Otter, reflectively, but no stability, especially in a boat. From where they sat, they could just get a glimpse of the main stream across the island that separated them, and just then a wager boat flashed into view, the rower, a short, stout figure, splashing badly and rolling a good deal, but working his hardest. The Rat stood up and hailed him, but Toad, for it was he, shook his head and settled sternly to his work. "He'll be out of the boat in a minute if he rolls like that," said the Rat, sitting down again. "Of course he will," chuckled the Otter. "Did I ever tell you that good story about Toad and the lock-keeper? It happened this way. Toad—" An errant mayfly swerved unsteadily by the current in the intoxicated fashion affected by young bloods of mayflies seeing life. A swirl of water and a clop, and the mayfly was visible no more. Neither was the Otter. The Mole looked down, his voice still in his ears, but the turf whereon he had sprawled was clearly vacant. Not an otter to be seen as far as the distant horizon. But again there was a streak of bubbles on the surface of the river. The Rat hummed a tune, and the Mole recalled that animal etiquette forbade any sort of comment on the sudden disappearance of one's friends at any moment, for whatever reason, or no reason whatsoever. "Well, well," said the Rat, "I suppose we ought to be moving. I wonder which of us had better pack the luncheon basket." He did not speak as if he was frightfully eager to. "Oh, please let me," said the Mole, so of course the Rat let him. Packing the basket was not quite such a pleasant affair as unpacking it. It never is. But the Mole was bent on enjoying everything, and although just when he had got the basket packed and strapped up tightly he saw a plate staring up from him on the grass, and when that job was done again the Rat pointed out a fork, which anybody ought to have seen, and last of all behold the mustard pot, which had somehow he had been sitting on without knowing it. Still, somehow, things got finished at last, without much loss of temper. The afternoon sun was getting low as the Rat sculled gently homeward in a dreamy mood, murmuring poetry things to himself, and not paying much attention to the Mole. But the Mole was very full of lunch and self-satisfaction and pride, and had already quite home at a boat, or so he thought, and was getting a bit restless, besides, and presently asked, "Ratty, please, I want to row now." Ratty shook his head with a smile. "Not yet, my young friend," he said. "Wait till you've had a few lessons. It's not as easy as it looks." The Mole was quiet for a minute or two, but he began to feel more jealous of the Rat, sculling so strongly, so easily along, and his pride began to whisper that he could do it every bit as well. He jumped up then and seized the sculls so suddenly that the Rat, who was gazing out over the water, saying more poetry things to himself, was taken by surprise and fell over backwards off his seat, with his legs in the air for the second time, while the triumphant Mole took his place and grabbed the sculls with entire confidence. "Stop it, you silly!" cried the Rat from the bottom of the boat. "You can't do it. You'll have us over." The Mole flung the sculls back with a flourish, and he made a great dig at the water. He missed the surface altogether, and his legs flew up over his head, and he found himself lying on top of the prostrate Rat. Greatly alarmed, he made a grab at the side of the boat, and the next moment, swoosh! Over the boat went, and he found himself struggling in the river. Oh my, how cold the water was, and so how very, very wet it felt, how it sang in his ears as he went down, down, down. How bright and welcome the sun looked as he rose to the surface coughing and spluttering. How black was his despair when he again felt himself sinking. Then a firm paw gripped him by the back of the neck. It was the Rat. He was evidently laughing. The Mole could feel him laughing, right down his arm and through his paw, and so into his, the Mole's, neck. The Rat got a hold of a scull and shoved it under the Mole's arm, and then he did the same with the other side of him, and swimming behind him, propelled the helpless animal to the shore and hauled him out to set him down on the bank, a squashy, pulpy lump of misery. When the Rat had rubbed him down a bit and wrung some of the wet out of him, he said, "Now then, old fellow, trot up and down the towing path as hard as you can, until you're warm and dry again, while I dive for the luncheon basket." So the dismal Mole went, without wet without and ashamed within, and trotted about until he was fairly dry, when the rat plunged into the water again, recovering the boat. He righted her and made her fast, and fetched his floating property to the shore by degrees, and then finally dived successfully for the luncheon basket, and struggled to land with it. When all was ready to start once more, the mole, limp and dejected, took his seat in the stern of the boat. As they set off, he said in a low voice, broken with emotion, "Ratty, my generous friend, I'm sorry indeed for my foolish and ungrateful conduct. My heart quite fails me when I think of how I might lost your beautiful luncheon basket. Indeed, I have been a complete fool, and I know it. Will you overlook this once and forgive me and let things go on as before?" "Oh, that's all right, bless you," responded the rat cheerily. "What's a little wet to a water rat? I'm in the water than out of it most days. Don't think any more about it. And look here, I really think you had better come and stop with me for a little time. It's very plain and rough, you know, not like Toad's house at all. But you haven't seen that yet, and I can make you comfortable, and I'll teach you how to row and how to swim, and soon you'll be as handy on the water as any of us." The mole was so touched by his kind manner of speaking that he could hardly find the voice to answer him, and he had to brush away a tear or two with the back of his paw. But the rat kindly looked in another direction, and presently the mole's spirits revived again, and he was even able to give some straight back talk to a couple of moor hens who were snickering to each other about his bedraggled appearance. When they got home, the rat made a bright fire in the parlor, and planted the mole in an armchair in front of it, having fetched down a dressing gown and slippers for him, and told him river stories till supper time. Very thrilling stories they were, too, to an earth-dwelling animal like the mole. Stories about wares and sudden floods, and leaping pikes, and streams that flung hard bottles, or at least bottles were certainly flung, from streams, and so presumably by them, about herons, and how particular they were about whom they spoke to, or about adventuring down drains, and night fishing with otter, or excursions far afield with badger. Supper was a most cheerful meal, but very shortly afterwards a terribly sleepy mole had to be escorted upstairs by his considerable host to the best bedroom, where he soon laid his head on the pillow in great peace and contentment, knowing that his new-found friend the river was lapping at the sills of his window. This day was only the first of many similar ones for the emancipated mole, each of them longer and full of interest. As the rippling summer moved onward, he learnt to swim and row, and entered into the joy of running water, and with his ear to the reed stems he caught, at intervals, something of what the wind went whispering so consistently among them. And that is the end of chapter 1. I hope you all enjoyed it. Do please let me know. I know that my voices could still use some work, particularly maintaining the same speech patterns. I've worked hard to figure out the voices for the main characters, but characters like Otter, who I think he only appears and talks that once. He's mentioned later, but he doesn't appear too much. Those characters are harder for me to get voices for. But yeah, please let me know what you think. Even if you didn't like it, I still want to know. Thanks for listening, guys.